And he asked me, what is the difference between being in recovery and recovering? And I should have known there was more to the question. I should have known. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Uncovery podcast. My name is Maddie, and I'm recovering from anorexia, and I talk about it on this podcast. Okay, today you will notice that we have moved to Saturday release day. It just works a little bit better for my schedule, I think, to get stuff out and have my weeks have to be a little bit more focused on a lot of work right now. Or you won't notice at all, and you'll just listen to this whenever you see it. You could still listen to it on a Wednesday. It just comes out on a Saturday. None of this matters. Time is a construct. Okay, New Year's resolutions. First week of January so far, actually going really well. I haven't really checked my budget app, but I have a feeling it's doing just fine. We're only a week in. I could not have blown it already. Social media have not been on. Totally fine. Thinking that this is going to be great for me. Living in the real world and not thinking about things through the lens of, oh, I wonder what other people would think of this. I think that's a really, really important mental thing to kind of get over. And dating. So maybe I don't know. Is it cheating on the social media resolution? Like, are dating apps considered social media? I was having this discussion with some people last weekend. I don't think it's the same because you're not like mindlessly scrolling. At least I'm not. That's just not, absolutely not how I treat it or can treat it. It's so, yeah. Anyway, there will be more on that in an episode actually about dating. So we'll just leave that for a while. The point is that so far it seems like 2023 is going to be a great year. And I forgot how being out of the dating game for a really long time, how dumb it makes you to be interested in people. It just turns you into an absolute teenager. Anyways, I hope you've all had a really great start to your 2023. And let's dive into today. We are talking about quasi recovery. And this is an old story, but a relevant story because it happened last year, but we just had other episodes lined up, so I didn't get to talk about this yet. But I was at a friend's going away party, and it was more or less early on and when I was kind of going out again, especially with bunches of people and at night and blah, 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 when my energy was finally kind of coming back. And I was nervous about it because of this, new body that I was in, having not seen people for a while. It was also exacerbated by seeing my ex who had, left the country for months and months before that and was back. And so I was very nervous about that at the time. So we are catching up, and I will keep this short for the sake of all of you listening. But when I had met this person that I had dated, I met him when I was sort of at the peak of the first time I went into recovery. So sort of the best I ever got that time around was when I actually met this person. And then in the interim years, I have relapsed to a variety of different degrees. So I guess he's one of only a couple of guys, at least, that have sort of observed the extremes of my eating disorder through the years, whether we were friends or whatever, or dating. And anyway, okay. For better or for worse, this man knows me well. And for better or for worse, we have a very unique way of doing conversation and the way that our minds work. We even did a podcast, but I digress. So I'm telling him about last year's kind of rock bottom and climbing to where I'm currently getting to, and the difference in my mindset this time around in recovery. And he asked me sort of, what is the difference between being in recovery and recovering? And for a second, I just thought I misheard him. So I was like, oh, people use them interchangeably. Should have known there was a deeper question there. But he's like, no, I mean, you're actually recovering now. And so in that moment, what clicked to me was the difference between being in recovery, in air quotes, and actually recovering, because being in recovery is sort of a vague state of being. Recovering is an action. It implies forward motion and effort. And so I think it's an important difference. And what it reminded me of is quasi recovery, which is now what we're going to kind of talk about. And this halfway out version of life where you get rid of pieces of your eating disorder or you do better, but you haven't let go of it completely. You haven't. So you sit in this sort of purgatory of recovery. And I would argue it's worse than either the eating disorder or being recovered. So anyways, let's talk about it. What is quasi recovery? It is not just the middle of recovery, not if you're actually acting and making change. So the middle of your recovery will look like quasi recovery because you still have these little pieces of the eating disorder or food fears that you're working on, and you haven't come all the way through to being recovered, but you're also not actively stuck in your eating disorder. You're wanting to move towards recovery. That's the middle of recovery. That's not really the same thing as quasi recovery. It's about a mindset. It's about a commitment thing. You either have your feet in the water or you're kind of standing on the beach with your toe in, and you could choose to exist in quasi recovery for the rest of your life and still carry this little piece of the eating disorder around with you. And usually during this period, you're still so afraid of so many things. Even if you've stopped behaviors, right? So you've either stopped the restriction or the purging or the excessive exercise or binging or whatever it is that were your eating disorder MOs. Even if you've stopped those, but you're sort of finagling still with your body or you're finagling with food behind the scenes and you're thinking about what you're eating and putting into your body in a way that a normal person wouldn't do. And you might be in this place which is the same where I was, and I was out with my eating disorder, right? Like I was public with my eating disorder. I was open about it. I was going to therapy. I was sort of seeing my dietitian, but mostly I was performing that I was doing some work on recovery without actually actively changing my eating behaviors or my exercise or whatever it was. So it's this sort of going through the motions of what looks like being in recovery without actually doing it. So like a lot of things, I think it's a gradient scale from almost like straight up relapse, falling back down the mountain through to just hanging on to the last little threads of your eating disorder and never fully really giving it up. That whole scale I would call quasi recovery. As long as you're not just like completely slipping back and you're like sort of just, your head is somewhat in the game, but not really. So maybe you're not having eating disorder behaviors or you're no longer relapsing into your illness to such a severe extent, but you're also not really experiencing all the benefits of recovery either because you're not really there yet. It feels very stuck. It feels very trapped. And it is so, so exhausting because you have to sort of put on that you want something that you're not actively working towards. Like, I'm in recovery from my eating disorder. I'm in recovery. And I know that this takes ages. I've been in this place for years and years at a time. Essentially from that peak of the first time I sort of went into recovery all the way until about a year ago when I really went like balls to the wall and did this thing for real. All of that time in between was either like a totally active relapse with these sort of like stints of, okay, I'm still kind of going to therapy or I'm seeing somebody or I'm sort of doing this. It was all quasi recovery. So I don't say this in any way to be like, this is wrong or shameful. This is a very, very real piece of a lot of people's eating disorder and recovery journey. It's really a matter of like, how long do you want to be stuck here? Like you could stay in quasi recovery forever. You could stay here and you could sort of get by for ages. But it would be such a half life to carry that around with you. Anyway, okay. So how to spot it. How do we spot it in ourselves or in others? I think a lot of treatment centers or treatment providers can overlook this stage of recovery because they're using the wrong metrics to measure it. And maybe this expands to other people that are kind of looking at people that are going through recovery, because just because someone's achieved weight restoration, and obviously I've made this point before, or made progress on paper, does not necessarily mean that they have fully recovered from their eating disorder. It is really common for people in eating disorder recovery to experience, like I said, this period of quasi recovery, which feels very stuck, like you're maybe not making as much progress as you would like to, but it is normal. And usually it's somebody that's made some improvement. So you're eating some more, including some more types of food in your diet. Maybe you're decreasing your exercise. You've stopped calorie counting. You've stopped binging a little bit or a lot or entirely. And you might also notice that your sleep is better, your digestion is better, your energy is better, your life is kind of coming back to a certain degree. But it also comes with all of these nasty little thoughts that are things like, oh, I can't put any more weight on than this. This is absolutely it. Like, I have to stop gaining weight now. I have to control the level of my weight gain in recovery. Or I shouldn't be so hungry anymore. Why am I still so hungry? I need to stop eating so much. I can't eat more food than this. I can't include whatever XYZ food. It's not healthy. It's too much sugar, etc. It ends up kind of transitioning from really, really disordered thoughts to just somewhat disordered thoughts, or more socially acceptable disordered thoughts. And I feel this sometimes where I'm like, oh, do I just have sort of like normal diety, culture-y, disordered eating type thoughts now rather than like full-blown eating disorder stuff? It's just like, oh, should I really be having that because it's not good for you, rather than, oh, I'm not going to have that because I'm afraid of gaining weight or things like that. So it's like you're prepared to do recovery to a certain extent, but won't allow yourself to cross some kind of bound, which is completely arbitrary. And the goalposts are always moving. So it's almost like they're more socially acceptable, but you're still not really free. But so many people get stuck here because there are mental and emotional barriers. There are social constructs that cause us to really not want to go past a certain point of recovery if it means gaining weight, because we've been in the world in this particular body ideal, which is in no way ideal. But it's really hard to let go of that identity. And it's also like, if you don't have the right supports in place for that kind of mucky middle of recovery, it's really easy to stay stuck in quasi or to slip back if you don't have either role models or therapists or people on your team that you just have to be able to lean on, especially in this crucial time. Like I've not the last couple of weeks, but for a while there when I was feeling quite, I don't know, like at risk because I was feeling so uncomfortable, I just doubled up on my therapy and dietitian appointments. I was like, I know I need more support now, even though my brain was like, you shouldn't need this. You've already gained weight. You shouldn't need this help. You've already gained weight. Like now's when the stuff like really gets tested, so that you don't just stay stuck here. Quasi recovery is also very, very lonely and isolating. And like I said, it is arguably the most torturous place to stay. It is worse than being all in on the eating disorder. It is worse than being all in on recovery, because it is not the best of both worlds. You're not like straddling this line of like, oh, perfectly balancing the eating disorder and life so that I can get the most out of everything. It's not. It's getting the worst out of both. Plus the exhaustion of the lying that you have to do, not only to yourself, but to others about how you're really doing. Because it's a lot like early recovery in that you feel like you're failing at recovery and failing at your eating disorder. And a lot of cases, right, you've gotten a handle on some of your behaviors, or you've gained some weight, or you've done quote unquote enough for people not to worry. And, you know, the whole you are doing so well, and not knowing how much of the eating disorder you might still have. So I want to be really, really clear. You cannot have a little bit of an eating disorder. You cannot have a little bit of an eating disorder. If you have a little bit of an eating disorder, you have an eating disorder. And all of us can choose that we do or do not keep a hold of that. However long that takes, however much work we need to put in to make that happen, we get to choose that. And we have to genuinely let go of the desire to control, shape, restrict our bodies, our food, our minds, our lives. But it's lonely because only you know what's truly in your mind and truly what your motivations are for your behaviors. I was the only one who knew when I was and was not really trying. I was the only one who knew what I was doing behind closed doors and behind the scenes to control my body, trying new things in front of my boyfriend, but never being able to be with people for long enough or being asked enough questions to really know that I was actually not recovered. But because I was doing therapy and I was open about my eating disorder, I was convinced, or was convincing, that I was quote unquote in recovery. It's like purgatory. It's not terrible. It's not great. So if you identify with this and you feel like this is you and you're feeling stuck, I hear you and I have been there. And it is absolutely brutal because you feel like you're not bad enough to really get more help, but you feel like you're really not healed. And you know that, and you know that. And we know, or we think we know, we believe, we have faith in the fact that there is full recovery and that we get better. But to really push through this middle is really tough. So the minute that I feel myself wishing for my eating disorder or contemplating relapse, or when I feel like I'm not really making progress, I tell my team, I did not used to do this. I would hide, I would skip appointments, I would avoid talking about it. That's how quasi recovery becomes relapse. You have to catch it before it catches you. And that's why I think this topic is so important, not just if you have an eating disorder recovering from one, or quote unquote in recovery from one, but if you're a loved one and you know someone that's going through this, learning about quasi recovery and sort of understanding what's going on is really going to help make sure that something like getting a little bit stuck or slowing down in recovery doesn't turn into backwards motion. So by sharing this knowledge with your support network, it's really powerful. It allows you to keep going. It allows you to find freedom. People around you will often be very relieved to see you make progress in recovery, especially physically. And through no fault of their own, they might not really understand the insidious little things that stick around much longer. So you kind of have to take inventory. And so what I try to do is benchmark to what a normal or a truly undisordered person would live like, or think about, or do. Like, what does the best version of me, what would the recovered version of me do? Or what would a recovered person do when making this decision? And it's really, really hard to always do that same thing, but at least be aware of what you think that might be. And the main thing to do is to get very, very, very honest with yourself, because here's the thing, you can't get the best of both worlds. It's not possible to fully recover while still holding on to disordered thoughts and behaviors. The mental and emotional components of an eating disorder are just as dangerous as the physical effects, and trying to preserve any of that will just hold us back. So it's this illusion of control that we can't quite let go of, and you can carry this forever, whether you've even had an eating disorder or not. Like, you could constantly live your life being like, oh, I just don't eat French fries. You could do that forever, and your life could look normal. Your life could look full. You could be happy. You can have all these little pieces of things that are just little tendrils of the eating disorder, and you could ignore them and you can pretend they're not there. But if you're still holding on to these bits and pieces, like, I don't eat cookies on Wednesdays, only on the weekend, and if I have 2 weeks off of the gym, I need to completely double down the weeks after to make up for everything that I wasn't doing before. Those are pieces of eating disorders, and you could live like that forever. You could. Or you could go actually all the way, do it all the way, and then just see what the world looks like. Just see what life looks like if you go all the way. So let's move out of quasi. recovery. Let's get out of the mucky middle. Let's finally release all of the nonsense that has come from years of either beating ourselves up or seeing ridiculous I hate the word misinformation because it's such a stupid overused word right now, but all of the false information and ridiculous claims that marketing and the diet industry have been feeding us, pun intended, for our entire lives. Let's continue to opt out of that and bit by bit, just claw our way out of this eating disorder thing. So all this to say is that I have needed and continued to need to reframe this whole thing in the way I talk about this. I'm not just in recovery. I'm recovering. It's a very small but very powerful difference that takes it into an action phase. So quasi recovery is terrible, but demonizing it is also not totally helpful. From what I understand, as far as I can tell, nearly everybody will go through a period of this, but it is an active choice to choose something different, to stop halfway or 80% of the way or 99% of the way and never really take a look in the mirror and say, I have to give up every piece of this. Oh, it was such bad news the first time my therapist back in the day ever told me this. I didn't believe her at that time, which is probably why I ended up in quasi recovery and relapse, is that I really didn't believe it, that you couldn't just keep a bit, that you couldn't kind of keep one foot on one side of the fence, like one foot out the door. But we can challenge that cognition and we are capable of more. You're absolutely capable of accepting or loving the body that you are in without restriction or control or optimization or design. So I have to continue to be blindly faithful that I can fully recover without keeping a shred of this. I don't know how long that will take to pry every one of those little grasping fingers off my ankles as I sort of trudge through the jungle towards the beach. But I know that if my feet are pointing in the right direction, and I know that if your feet are pointing in the right direction, eventually we will get there. So there's no one coming to save us. We just have to walk out. And that's pretty much all I have to say about quasi recovery. It's insidious. It's very difficult to pick up on and spot. It's very convenient to keep certain parts of your eating disorder. But if we think about it and we talk about it more, then maybe more people can avoid getting stuck, at least for too long. Okay, so that's the first episode of the new year. Let's ditch all these little tendrils of the eating disorder in 2023. And if you are on Apple Podcasts on your phone, since you're already on your phone, you might as well go over to the podcast page and leave us a rating and a review. It means the world. And other than that, we'll see you on the next episode.